The airport buzzed with its usual rhythm, hurried footsteps, the hum of conversations, and the distant roar of engines. David Harris stood in line at gate C-22, blending seamlessly into the crowd. His dark jeans, plain polo shirt, and well-worn sneakers were deliberate. He wanted to experience what his passengers did. Skybound Airlines was his pride, but he knew that to lead effectively, he needed to understand the nuances of the customer experience firsthand. As David approached the ticket scanner, he smiled at the airline attendant, a young woman who seemed a bit stressed but determined to remain professional. "Good morning," David said warmly, handing over his boarding pass. She scanned it but frowned. The scanner beeped red, and a small error message flashed on her screen. One moment, sir. Let me try again." She ran it through once more, but the error persisted. David tilted his head curiously. "Is something wrong?" Before the attendant could respond, John Carter, the security officer stationed nearby, stepped forward. His presence was commanding, not because of professionalism but because of his stern, overbearing demeanor. His sharp, scrutinizing gaze landed on David, and a flicker of suspicion crossed his face. "Problem here?" John asked, his tone sharp. "It's probably just a system glitch," the attendant replied hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable under John's stare. "I'll get the supervisor to check." John, however, ignored her and turned fully to David. "Let me see your ID and that boarding pass." David, unfazed, handed over both. He'd dealt with countless egos in his career, and he wasn't about to lose his composure now. "Here you go." John inspected the boarding pass and ID with exaggerated care, then glanced at David with a raised eyebrow. "This doesn't add up." David's brow furrowed slightly. "What doesn't add up?" "You don't look like someone flying first class," John said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a few passengers nearby. David blinked, his calm exterior momentarily shaken. "Excuse me? You heard me?" John gestured to the ticket. "This seat isn't cheap, and something about this doesn't sit right. I think you forged it." The murmurs around them grew louder as more passengers turned to watch the unfolding drama. David remained calm, but his voice carried an edge now. "That's quite an accusation. I'd appreciate it if you confirmed with your system before making assumptions." John scoffed. "People like you think you can just walk into places you don't belong. But not on my watch." The words hit like a slap. David felt the heat of humiliation rising in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction. The attendant interjected nervously. "Mr. Carter, it's probably just a technical issue. I was about to call Emily." "No need," John interrupted. "I've seen enough." He stepped closer to David, invading his space. "You either come with me quietly or we escalate this." David met his gaze evenly. "I'm not going anywhere. Call your supervisor." The tension crackled in the air. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress whispered to her companion, "Can you believe this?" The nerve of some people. Another man in a business suit muttered, "Just let the guy through already." "This is ridiculous." Emily Parker arrived moments later, her brisk walk and confident demeanor cutting through the thick atmosphere. She glanced at the growing crowd, the visibly flustered attendant, and John standing toe-to-toe with David. "What's going on here?" Emily asked, her tone firm but calm. "Caught this guy trying to board with a fake ticket," John declared, holding up David's boarding pass as if it were evidence of a crime. Emily's eyes flicked to David, and recognition dawned instantly. Her expression shifted from confusion to mortification. "Mr. Harris," she said softly, almost inaudibly. Then louder, "Mr. Harris, I'm so sorry." John froze. His confidence faltered, but he quickly masked it. "Wait, you know this guy?" "Yes, I do," Emily replied sharply. She turned to David, her face red with embarrassment. "Mr. Harris, I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding. If you'll give me a moment, I'll—" "Wait," John interrupted. "Who exactly is he?" Emily turned to him with a steely glare. "He's David Harris, the founder and CEO of Skybound Airlines." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. John's face drained of color as the weight of his mistake sank in. David, however, didn't revel in the revelation. Instead, he turned to Emily. What exactly caused the error with my ticket? Emily hesitated, then checked the system on her tablet. Her fingers moved quickly, her brows knitting in concentration. After a moment, she looked up, visibly distressed. It's a system error, Mr. Harris. The update we pushed last week caused some boarding pass validations to fail intermittently. It's entirely our fault. David nodded, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Emily. Please make sure this is addressed immediately. He then turned to John, whose bravado had crumbled. Mr. Carter, your assumptions were loud and clear. I can't say I'm surprised, but I am disappointed. John opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. David scanned the crowd, taking in their wide eyes and murmurs. This isn't about me, he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of leadership. I have the resources to stand up to situations like this, but many others don't. If a system error can lead to humiliation like this for me, imagine what it could do to someone else. The passengers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his words settling over them. Emily stepped forward, visibly shaken. Mr. Harris, I'll make sure this is resolved. And I'll personally oversee additional training for all staff. David held her gaze. Good. But let's not stop there. This isn't just about training. It's about creating a culture where this doesn't happen in the first place. He turned to the attendant who had initially tried to help. You did your job with professionalism. Thank you. The young woman looked relieved, nodding quickly. With that, David walked past the gate and boarded the plane, leaving a trail of stunned silence in his wake. Emily remained behind, already barking orders to staff. John stood rooted to the spot, his humiliation complete. The first-class cabin of the skybound flight was quiet and luxurious, with a faint scent of leather and fresh coffee. David Harris settled into his seat by the window, his face a mask of composure. But inside, the humiliation simmered. He had built this airline to be a beacon of excellence, and yet he had just been humiliated at his own gate. As he fastened his seatbelt, a flight attendant approached. Her badge read Clara. She smiled nervously, clearly aware of what had just unfolded at the gate. Mr. Harris, welcome aboard, she said softly. Can I get you anything to start with? David looked up at her, his tone polite but firm. Just water. Thank you. Clara nodded, hesitated for a moment, then leaned closer. I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry about what happened out there. That shouldn't have. David raised a hand gently. Thank you, Clara. Let's focus on the flight now, shall we? She straightened, understanding the dismissal, and left to fetch his water. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit and designer glasses was staring at David. His curiosity finally got the better of him. You're the guy from the gate, the man said. The CEO, right? David turned his head, nodding. That's correct. The man leaned in, lowering his voice. I've got to say, that was uncomfortable to watch. That security guy was way out of line. David's jaw tightened. It was more than that. His assumptions weren't just out of line. They were revealing. The man frowned. What do you mean? Imagine if I hadn't been who I am, David said. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of steel. If I didn't have a title, if I wasn't the CEO, would anyone have stood up for me? Or would everyone have just watched, like they did today? The man shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. Well, I mean, it's hard to step in sometimes, you know? You don't want to make things worse. David gave him a long, measured look. Silence often makes things worse. The man flushed, mumbling something about needing to catch up on emails, and turned to his laptop. Clara returned with David's water, placing it gently on the tray in front of him. She glanced at him, as if debating whether to say more, but ultimately moved on. As the plane taxied down the runway, David leaned back, closing his eyes. He needed to focus. This wasn't just about him. This was about fixing a deeper issue, one that couldn't be solved with a simple apology. Meanwhile, back at the gate, Emily Parker stood with her arms crossed, glaring at John Carter. The crowd had dispersed, but the tension between them was thick. What were you thinking? Emily demanded, her voice low but sharp. John shuffled uncomfortably. I was just doing my job. His ticket didn't scan. Stop, Emily snapped. You know that's not what this is about. You didn't just question his ticket. You questioned his right to be here. And you did it in front of everyone. John's face hardened defensively. Look, I didn't know who he was. He could have been anyone. That's the problem. Emily's voice rose slightly before she caught herself. She took a deep breath, trying to stay professional. You don't treat people like that. It doesn't matter if they're the CEO or someone flying for the first time in their life. John looked away, his jaw tight. I was just following protocol. No, Emily said, her tone icy. You were following your biases. The words hit John like a slap. He opened his mouth to retort, but couldn't find the words. Emily stepped closer, lowering her voice. Do you have any idea how much damage you just caused? Not just to him, but to our entire company? People recorded that scene, John. It's going to be all over social media by the end of the day. John paled. I didn't think. That's the problem, Emily interrupted. You didn't think. And now I have to report this incident directly to Mr. Harris, who, in case you forgot, is not just our CEO but also the man who saved this company from bankruptcy. John swallowed hard, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. Back on the plane, David opened his laptop, the glow of the screen lighting up his face. His inbox was already filling with emails from executives who had likely heard about the incident. But one message caught his eye. It was from the IT department, marked urgent. Subject: boarding pass error investigation. David clicked it open, scanning the contents. Mr. Harris, we've confirmed that the error with your boarding pass was caused by a system glitch in the recent software update. The issue affects a small percentage of passengers with first-class tickets purchased through third-party vendors. We're working on a patch now and expect it to be resolved within 24 hours. David sighed, his fingers drumming on the keyboard. A system failure. That explained the technical side of the problem, but it didn't explain the human one. He began typing a response, his thoughts sharp and deliberate. To the IT team. Fixing the glitch is a start, but we need to dig deeper. How was this missed during testing? And why wasn't the staff briefed about potential errors? A software issue shouldn't result in public humiliation for any passenger. Let's discuss this further in tomorrow's leadership meeting. Best. David. He hit send, then closed his laptop. The weight of the day pressed heavily on him. As the flight reached cruising altitude, the man across the aisle spoke again. I've been thinking about what you said, he admitted. About silence making things worse. David looked at him, his expression softer now. For what it's worth, the man continued. I'll speak up next time. David nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. That's a start. For the rest of the flight, David stared out the window, the endless expanse of clouds mirroring the challenges ahead. This wasn't just about fixing a system or reprimanding an employee. It was about changing a culture, one that extended far beyond the confines of Skybound Airlines. And he was ready for the fight. The meeting room on the top floor of Skybound Airlines headquarters was bathed in sunlight. Its glass walls overlooked the city skyline, but the atmosphere inside was anything but bright. A dozen executives sat around the table, their expressions a mix of anxiety and forced neutrality. David Harris stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding yet calm. Let's begin, David said, his voice steady. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. As you all know, I was involved in an incident at Gate C-22 yesterday. An incident that highlights serious gaps in our operations, both technical and human. A murmur rippled through the room. Some executives exchanged uneasy glances, while others shifted in their seats. David turned to Emily Parker, who sat on his right. Emily, let's start with your report. Emily cleared her throat, her posture tense but professional. As you requested, Mr. Harris, I've conducted a thorough review of the gate staff's actions and the system failure. The technical issue originated from a software update that created a glitch in first-class ticket validations. This issue affected approximately 2% of passengers, mostly those who booked through third-party vendors. David raised an eyebrow. 2% might not sound like much, but it's still unacceptable. How long has this been happening? Emily hesitated. The update was rolled out 10 days ago, so roughly that long. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. One, a man in a crisp navy suit named Peter Mills, interjected. Mr. Harris, while the technical glitch is regrettable, I think the real issue here was the human error. The security guard acted unprofessionally, and— Stop, David said, his tone firm but not loud. His eyes bore into Peter's. We don't get to shift blame that easily. Yes, there was unprofessionalism, but what created the opportunity for that? The system failure. It all connects. Peter nodded quickly, leaning back in his chair. David addressed the room again. Emily, continue. She nodded, glancing at her notes. I also reviewed staff training records. While we have standard protocols for addressing ticket issues, there's no specific guidance on handling situations caused by system errors. Furthermore, the security team hasn't received comprehensive bias training in over 3 years. That last statement hung in the air like a storm cloud. David let it linger before speaking. 3 years, he repeated. In an industry where public perception and customer trust are everything, we let 3 years pass without reinforcing something as critical as bias training. The room fell silent. David turned to the IT director, a woman named Linda Chen. Linda, what's being done to fix the glitch? Linda straightened. We've already deployed a patch, and I've instructed my team to run additional tests to ensure this doesn't happen again. I'll have a full report on the update's oversight by the end of the week. Good, David said, his tone even. Then his eyes swept across the room. But fixing the glitch doesn't solve the root problem. Let me tell you what I experienced yesterday. The executives leaned forward slightly, their attention fully on him. I wasn't treated as a CEO, David began. And that's fine because I didn't present myself as one. But I also wasn't treated as a human being. I was treated as someone who didn't belong. And that treatment wasn't just because of a ticket error, it was because of assumptions. Assumptions that went unchecked. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. This isn't just about me, he continued. Imagine a passenger without my resources or my voice. How many others have faced similar situations and walked away, not just humiliated, but determined never to fly with us again? How many voices have we silenced because they didn't think they'd be heard? The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning was audible. David straightened. Here's what's going to happen. First, every department will conduct a full audit of their training and operational protocols. Emily, you'll lead this effort with a cross-functional team. Emily nodded. Yes, sir. Second, David continued, we'll implement mandatory bias training for all employees, from the gate staff to the C-suite. No exceptions. Peter Mills shifted again. Mr. Harris, I understand the importance of this, but mandatory training for all employees, that's a significant investment. Are you sure it's necessary? David's gaze hardened. If we're not willing to invest in the humanity of our employees and passengers, then we don't deserve to lead in this industry. Does anyone else have concerns about the cost? The room remained silent. David nodded. Good. And finally, I want a dedicated customer advocacy team established. Their job will be to handle complaints, track systemic issues, and ensure that every voice is heard. This isn't just about preventing problems. It's about creating a culture where they're less likely to arise in the first place. Linda raised a hand tentatively. Mr. Harris, if I may? Go ahead. I think this is the right direction, Linda said. But changing a culture takes time. How do we measure success along the way? David smiled faintly. By listening. To our employees, to our passengers, and to the world outside these walls. We don't get to decide when we've done enough. They do. The room absorbed his words, the gravity of the task ahead settling over them. Later that evening, David sat alone in his office, the city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His laptop pinged with a new email. Subject: a passenger's experience. Curious, he opened it. The email was from a young woman who had witnessed the incident at the gate. Dear Mr. Harris, I was there yesterday when the security guard confronted you. At first, I didn't realize who you were. I just saw someone being treated unfairly, and I didn't speak up. I wanted to apologize for that. Watching you handle the situation with grace and strength inspired me. Thank you for turning something ugly into a chance for change. Sincerely, Rachel M. David leaned back in his chair, the email stirring something deep within him. Change wouldn't come easily, but it was worth fighting for. And this was only the beginning. The Employee Training Center at Skybound Airlines bustled with activity. Rows of desks were arranged neatly, and a projector displayed the title, Bias Awareness and Empathy Workshop. A mix of employees filled the room. Gate agents, flight attendants, security personnel, and even a few mid-level managers. John Carter sat near the back, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His body language screamed discomfort, but his eyes betrayed a hint of unease. The humiliation from his encounter with David Harris hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened, especially after he learned about the mandatory training. It wasn't just for him. Everyone had to attend. But John couldn't shake the feeling that the room's eyes occasionally darted his way, as if he were the reason they were all here. The instructor, a calm yet commanding woman named Naomi Bennett, began the session. "Good morning, everyone," Naomi said, her tone inviting yet firm. "Today's session is about understanding bias, the assumptions we all make, often without realizing it, and learning how to see people for who they truly are." John shifted in his seat, his lips pressing into a thin line. Naomi noticed, but didn't call him out. Instead, she clicked to the next slide, which read, Understanding Assumptions. "To start," Naomi said, "I'd like you all to think about a moment when you were judged unfairly. Maybe it was based on how you looked, where you came from, or something completely outside your control. Take a minute." The room grew quiet. People stared at their desks or out the window, their expressions introspective. John resisted the exercise at first, but a memory surfaced despite himself. Years ago, he'd been a rookie security guard, full of enthusiasm. One night, while responding to a call, he'd been mistaken for a suspect by the police. The humiliation and anger he felt that night had stayed with him, though he'd buried it deep. Naomi continued, breaking the silence. "Now, imagine living through that kind of judgment every day. Imagine it shaping how people treat you, how opportunities are given or taken away." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. John's grip on his crossed arms loosened slightly. Meanwhile, David Harris was meeting with Emily Parker and Linda Chun in his office. The morning sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the plans spread across his desk. "We've rolled out the software patch," Linda reported. "No further issues with ticket validation have been reported." "Good," David said. "But fixing the system isn't enough." "Emily, how's the training initiative being received?" Emily hesitated. "It's mixed. Most employees are receptive, but some are resistant, especially in security. They feel like they're being unfairly targeted." David leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "Change is always uncomfortable, but discomfort isn't a reason to stop. It's a reason to push harder." Linda chimed in, her tone cautious. "Speaking of resistance, Mr. Harris, there's been some pushback from the board. They're concerned about the cost of these initiatives and the potential backlash from staff." David's jaw tightened. "Backlash from doing the right thing? Let them know I'll address their concerns directly at the next board meeting." Emily and Linda exchanged a glance, silently admiring David's resolve. Back in the training session, Naomi introduced a role-playing exercise. Volunteers were asked to act out scenarios where bias could influence decisions. "Who's up first?" Naomi asked. To everyone's surprise, John Carter stood. His jaw was set, his posture rigid, but there was a flicker of determination in his eyes. "I'll do it," he said gruffly. Naomi smiled, sensing this was a significant step. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Let's set the scene." In the exercise, John played the role of a gate agent interacting with a passenger whose ticket had a minor issue. Another employee acted as the passenger, a young man dressed casually, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. John approached the situation as he always had, with authority and a hint of skepticism. "Sir, your ticket isn't scanning. Where did you get this?" The passenger hesitated, fumbling with his backpack. I bought it online." "Is something wrong?" John's tone sharpened. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. Are you sure this is your ticket?" Naomi stepped in, pausing the exercise. Let's stop here for a moment. John, what's your initial assumption about this passenger? John frowned. I don't know. That maybe he didn't buy the ticket himself? And why is that your assumption? Naomi pressed gently. John opened his mouth to respond, but faltered. He glanced at the passenger, who looked downcast, his shoulders slumping under the imaginary weight of suspicion. Naomi let the silence linger before speaking. This is what bias does. It creates assumptions, often without evidence, and those assumptions shape how we treat others. Recognizing that is the first step to changing it. John's face reddened, but he nodded slowly. I get it. Naomi smiled. Good. Let's try the scenario again, but this time, focus on curiosity, not suspicion. By the end of the session, the room's energy had shifted. Employees were chatting in small groups, reflecting on what they'd learned. John remained quiet, but his posture was less defensive, his expression more thoughtful. As the employees filed out, Naomi approached John. You did well today, she said. John looked at her, his face a mix of gratitude and regret. Thanks. I've got a lot to think about. That's the point, Naomi said with a smile. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step counts. That evening, David received an update from Emily about the training sessions. John Carter participated actively, she said, sounding surprised. I think he's starting to reflect on what happened. David nodded. Good. Everyone deserves the chance to grow. Emily hesitated. Do you really think he'll change? David's gaze was steady. I think he has to decide that for himself. But we'll give him the tools to make that decision. As Emily left, David looked out his office window at the city below. The work was far from over, but moments like this reminded him why he'd started Skybound Airlines in the first place. Not just to connect people through travel, but to bridge the divides that kept them apart. And now he was more determined than ever. Months later, Skybound Airlines was abuzz with change. The training initiatives were complete, the software glitches resolved, and the new customer advocacy team was fully operational. Employees at every level spoke about the shift in the company's culture, one that prioritized fairness, empathy, and accountability. David Harris stood at a podium in the airline's main conference hall. The annual staff meeting had drawn employees from across the country, filling the room with hundreds of faces. He adjusted the microphone and smiled. Thank you all for being here today, he began. His voice was warm, but his presence carried the authority of a man who had weathered storms and come out stronger. A few months ago, I had an experience at Gate C-22, David continued. An experience that exposed cracks in our foundation, not just in our systems, but in how we see and treat one another. The room was silent, every eye on him. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on that day, David said. What stood out to me wasn't just the mistakes made, but the opportunities they revealed. Opportunities to grow, to do better, and to lead the way in creating an airline where everyone, employees and passengers alike, feels valued and respected. He paused, scanning the room. The changes we've made since then weren't easy. They required honesty, discomfort, and a willingness to confront our own biases. But they were necessary. And I'm proud of the progress we've made. The audience broke into applause, but David raised a hand to quiet them. This isn't just about patting ourselves on the back. Change is ongoing. It requires vigilance and commitment, day after day. But I believe in this team, and I believe in our ability to keep growing. In the crowd, John Carter sat near the back, listening intently. The months since that fateful day had been humbling for him. The training sessions had forced him to confront not only his biases, but the reasons behind them. He'd apologized to David personally, and while the conversation had been brief, David's response had stayed with him. Growth takes courage, David had said. And courage starts with accountability. John's journey wasn't over, but he was determined to continue. He'd even begun mentoring new hires, sharing his experiences to help them avoid his mistakes. After the meeting, employees mingled in the lobby. David stood near the exit, shaking hands and chatting with staff. When John approached, David's expression softened. "Mr. Carter," David said, extending a hand. John shook it firmly. I just wanted to say thank you for giving me a second chance. David smiled. Everyone deserves a chance to grow. The real question is, what do you do with it? John nodded, his voice steady. I'm doing my best to make it count. David clapped him on the shoulder. That's all anyone can ask. Later that evening, David returned home. He poured himself a glass of wine and settled into his favorite armchair, looking out at the city lights. His phone buzzed with a notification, a message from the customer advocacy team. Subject: monthly report, passenger feedback. David opened the email and scrolled through the highlights. One entry caught his eye. Passenger, Rachel M. Feedback: Skybound Airlines has become my airline of choice. After witnessing Mr. Harris handle a difficult situation with grace and seeing the changes the company has made since then, I feel confident that this is a business that values its customers. Thank you for leading by example. David smiled, his heart light. Change was never easy, but moments like this reminded him why it mattered. Looking out at the night sky, he thought about the journey ahead. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But just like the planes that bore the name of the company he'd built, David believed in rising above, in aiming higher, striving harder, and always reaching for something greater. After all, the sky wasn't just a destination. It was a boundless reminder of what was possible.